Okay, my name is Mike Anderson. My display here is uniforms of the American Revolution. Basically, the uniforms of our first armed forces. If you start over here to the left, we have the Minutemen. They were really America's first armed forces. They did not have uniforms. They were basically made up of the elite soldiers or men that were in the militia. They were called Minutemen because they took their equipment, their weapon, to work with them, and if they were called upon for service, in a minute's notice they could gather their weapon and their gear and be prepared to fight. And that actually happened in April of 1775 at the battles of Concord and Lexington. Now it took a while. The war began in April of 1775. The Declaration of Independence wasn't until July of the next year before we actually declared our independence. So it wasn't, but they began to form the different branches of service during the Revolutionary War. In '75, the first one that was organized was our infantry units. And they were the foot soldiers. I'm dressed as an infantry soldier. You see I have my musket and pretty much all the gear I need on my person. Other branches of service, the men that fired the big cannons, artillery. So their equipment was different than that of infantrymen. They had what they call a bricole, that's the brown colored strap which had a rope with a hook on, and they used the bricole, the men to hook onto rings on the cannon and move the cannon around the battlefield with the bricole. You can see on his buff leather belt, my cups there in the back, you can see in his buff leather belt there's a little hammer and there's a little pick there. That pick was used to punch the powder bag once it was loaded down the barrel to poke a hole where the fuse was placed to light the cannon. Inside
There's lunch in the kitchen whenever you're
Okay,
ready.
thank you so much. Inside the cartridge box, it had little spikes, iron spikes. If the artillery was ever overrun, they couldn't remove the artillery, they would pull a spike out, put it in the vent hole, and they'd use the little hammer there to bust it off so the enemy couldn't use the cannon against them. Now coming to the left here, we have an example of mounted troops. And there are two different types of mounted troops. There are cavalry and dragoons. And everybody asks, well, they're both mounted, they're both on horses, and probably the two most important duties of mounted troops is they were the eyes and ears of the infantry. The infantry moved slowly, they didn't know where the enemy was, so the cavalry could protect their flanks, the front and the rear. Now the difference between cavalry and dragoons is cavalry, they pretty much did all their fighting off of a horse, where a dragoon mounted soldier, he could fight from the horse or off the horse. He'd carry a small gun, a carbine, that he could use when he was fighting off the horse. But their primary duty was acting as messengers or protecting the infantry when they're on the march or during battle. Of course, we talked about the infantry in the middle. The unit that we like to portray is the 1st Maryland. So the buttons are 1MR, this 1st Maryland Regiment. The 1st Maryland Regiment was one of the fiercest fighting units in the Continental Army. At the Battle of Guilford Courthouse, they went up against the Royal Guard, the British Royal Guard. They were the most elite troops, and they were defeating the Royal Guard, and General Cornwallis, the British commander, actually ordered his artillery to fire at the 1st Maryland, but at the same time they were killing their own guys, trying to destroy the 1st Maryland because they were such fierce fighters. Next is Navy. They're the only ones that really didn't have regulation uniforms. The officers had regulation uniforms, but what they wore is just the same thing that all sailors wore, work clothing. So you see the pants, they're not really a pants, they're called slops. They're really loose fitting because they had to be able to climb the riggings and work the sails. The coat was a workman's jacket, so they were workmen and they needed to move around and needed to do it quickly. The Marines were actually the fighting force with the Navy. They were on the ships with the Navy. When the Navy got into battle and two ships got side by side, the Marines would actually crawl up the riggings and they'd have a musket that they'd fire down into the ship. The Marines would also carry in their cartridge boxes grenades. So one of the stories the Marines like to talk about is during one of the battles, one of the Marines was up in the riggings, he pulled out a grenade, lit the grenade, threw it in the British ship, it bounced on the deck, down in the powder magazine and blew up the whole ship. It's actually a true story, but the Marines make sure that we remember that story. Everything's made out of natural fiber fabrics. Natural fiber fabrics, wool and linen were the two most popular ones. Cotton was very expensive, and so was silk. So the soldiers, this is linen, this is wool. A lot of the underclothing is linen, and outer clothing was wool. Now, if they were able to get uniforms as designed, they would get the wool uniforms in the winter and the linen during the summer, but most of the time they were lucky to get anything at all. So they didn't always all look nice and trim like I do. A lot of times they were in rags. Some would have their leftover summer clothing, linen, and some would have, wholly wool clothing from their winter uniform. So it's just kind of a mishmash of stuff.